The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across Redemption Creek as Jedediah Drake squinted through the dust, his weathered hand resting on the worn handle of his Colt. The small mining town was the last place he expected to find trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him no matter how far he rode. It was the summer of 1876, and the West was changing. The days of wild frontier justice were fading like the daylight, but not fast enough for Jedediah. At 32, he'd seen more death than most men twice his age. 10 years as a bounty hunter had left its mark, not just in the scars that crisscrossed his tanned skin, but in the cold emptiness that had replaced whatever heart he once possessed. Drake, the saloon keeper, nodded as Jed pushed through the swinging doors of the prospector's promise. "Thought you'd moved on." "Not yet," Jed replied, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. He rarely spoke more than necessary these days. Words were like bullets once fired, you couldn't take them back. "Usual," Jed nodded, taking the whiskey without so much as a thank you. The amber liquid burned familiar fire down his throat. He'd come to Redemption Creek to deliver a prisoner and collect his bounty, but found himself lingering. There was nothing special about this town, a collection of rough-hewn buildings clinging to the edge of civilization, but nowhere else was calling his name. The piano player in the corner hammered out a jaunty tune that didn't match the mood of the half-empty saloon. A few miners hunched over cards in the corner, and 2 working girls leaned against the bar, their painted faces tired in the lamplight. "Any work around here?" Jed asked after his second drink. The saloon keeper, a man called Peterson who'd lost an eye in the war, shrugged. "Silver mines always hiring, though not the type of work you usually take, Drake. I mean the other kind." Jed's fingers tapped the worn wanted poster folded in his pocket. Hunting men was all he knew. Sheriff might have something. Stagecoach got robbed last week heading to Santa Fe. Jed nodded, considering. He wasn't desperate for money yet, but idle hands made him restless. Restlessness made him remember, and remembering was something he avoided at all costs. The saloon doors swung open, letting in a gust of cool evening air and a woman Jed had never seen before. She wasn't dressed like the saloon girls, but in a simple blue dress, her honey-brown hair pulled back from a face that looked out of place in the rough establishment. "Mr. Peterson," she called to the barkeeper. "Is Dr. Wallace here tonight, Miss Grayson?" Peterson nodded respectfully. "Doc's not been in. Might check the boarding house." Jed found himself watching her. There was something different about her, a determination in the set of her shoulders, yet a vulnerability in her eyes that caught his attention. "Thank you," she said, turning to leave when her gaze momentarily locked with Jed's. For a fraction of a second, their eyes met hers, a startling blue against his storm gray, before she quickly looked away and hurried out. "Who's that?" Jed asked, surprising himself with his interest. "Bethany Grayson, schoolteacher, came out from Boston about 6 months ago." Peterson refilled Jed's glass without being asked. "Good woman, too good for this place." Jed drained his whiskey and set the glass down with a thud. He'd learned long ago not to get curious about other people's stories. Everyone out here was running from something or someone, himself included. "What's she want with the doctor?" Peterson raised his one eyebrow. "Her brother's sick. Consumption, folks say." He leaned in closer. "She's been trying everything to help him. Brought him out west hoping the air would do him good, but—" He shook his head. "Ain't looking good." Jed grunted, annoyed at himself for asking. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. He had enough ghosts of his own to contend with. He flipped a coin onto the bar and stepped out into the night. The full moon illuminated the single dusty street running through town. Down at the far end, he could see the schoolhouse, a small lamp glowing in its window despite the late hour. Jed pulled his hat lower and headed toward his room at the boarding house. Tomorrow he'd see about that stagecoach robbery, get himself back on the trail where he belonged. Staying in one place too long made him uneasy, like wearing a shirt that didn't quite fit. As he passed the doctor's house, he noticed the same woman, Miss Grayson, sitting on the porch steps, her face in her hands. Even from a distance, he could see her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a moment, something long dormant stirred in his chest. Then he hardened his resolve and continued walking. Whatever troubles she had weren't his to solve. In his experience, getting involved only led to more pain for everyone. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of crisp mountain air that had drawn so many folks west in search of new beginnings. Jed met with the sheriff, a gruff man named Harris who'd heard of Jedediah Drake and his reputation. The stagecoach robbery wasn't much to go on. 3 masked men, one with a distinctive limp, had taken the strongbox containing the mine payroll and disappeared into the hills. "I can pay you 20% of whatever you recover," Sheriff Harris offered. "Town council authorized it." Jed considered the job. It would be straightforward enough, and the hills to the north where the robbers had fled were familiar territory. "I'll take it," he agreed, shaking the sheriff's hand. As he left the office, a commotion drew his attention to the general store across the street. The schoolteacher, Miss Grayson, was arguing with the proprietor, her voice raised in uncharacteristic frustration. "I don't care what it costs, Mr. Simmons. If you can get it, I'll pay for it," she insisted. "Miss Grayson, I understand your situation, but that medicine you're asking for, even if I could get it from Denver, it costs more than 3 months of your teaching salary," the storekeeper replied, his tone sympathetic but firm. "Then I'll pay in installments. Please, Mr. Simmons." The desperation in her voice was palpable even from where Jed stood. "I'll see what I can do," Simmons relented, "but I can't promise anything." Bethany Grayson emerged from the store, her face a mask of controlled emotion. When she saw Jed watching, something like defiance flashed in her eyes before she straightened her shoulders and walked briskly past him. "Miss Grayson," Jed found himself calling after her, unsure why he was getting involved. She stopped, turning slowly. "Yes." Up close, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the strain evident in the tight line of her mouth. Yet there was a fierce dignity about her that commanded respect. "I couldn't help overhearing," Jed said, feeling uncharacteristically awkward. "Your brother is ill." "Yes." Her answer was clipped, wary. "Jacob has tuberculosis." Jed nodded, knowing all too well how the disease could waste a person away to nothing. He'd seen it during the war, had watched good men drown in their own blood. "I'm sorry," he offered, the words feeling inadequate. "Are you?" she challenged, surprising him with her directness. "Or are you just being polite, Mr. Drake, Jedediah Drake?" He touched the brim of his hat. "And no, madam, I don't say things to be polite." A small smile, fleeting but genuine, crossed her face. Refreshing honesty. That's rare in Redemption Creek. She looked him over more carefully. "You're the bounty hunter, aren't you? I've heard the children talking about you." Jed shifted uncomfortably. "I track men who have broken the law, yes. And what brings you to our little town, Mr. Drake? Surely not our charm and hospitality." There was a hint of wry humor beneath her exhaustion. "Work," he answered simply. "Sheriff's got me chasing after stagecoach robbers." She nodded, then glanced at the position of the sun overhead. "I need to get back to Jacob." "Good day, Mr. Drake." He watched her walk away, her spine straight despite what he imagined was the crushing weight of her brother's illness. Something about her stirred a memory of another woman who'd faced adversity with that same quiet strength. His sister, Sarah, before the fever had taken her and her infant daughter 10 years ago. Jed shook off the unwelcome recollection, and focused on the task at hand. He spent the rest of the day gathering supplies and information about the robbery. By late afternoon, he'd learned enough to begin tracking in the morning. The man with the limp was known to some in town, a drifter named Carson who'd worked at the livery for a few weeks before disappearing the day before the robbery. As evening approached, Jed found himself walking toward the small cabin at the edge of town where Miss Grayson and her brother lived. He told himself he was just scouting the terrain before his departure tomorrow, but the lie sat uncomfortably in his mind. The cabin was modest but well kept, with a small veranda and a vegetable garden struggling to thrive in the rocky soil. Through the window, he could see Miss Grayson sitting beside a bed, reading aloud to a thin figure propped up on pillows. Jed stood in the shadows of a pine tree, watching the domestic scene with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to feel anything beyond the cold satisfaction of a bounty collected, or the numbing embrace of whiskey. He was about to turn away when the cabin door opened and Bethany Grayson stepped out, hugging herself against the evening chill. "I know you're there, Mr. Drake," she called softly. "Most people don't lurk in shadows unless they want something." Caught, Jed stepped forward into the moonlight. "Just passing by," he lied. "Of course." Her tone made it clear she didn't believe him for a second. "Would you like some coffee?" "Jacob is finally sleeping and She hesitated. "I could use some company that doesn't require me to be brave for a few minutes." The invitation surprised him, and his first instinct was to refuse. Getting involved in other people's lives was dangerous. It made you vulnerable, gave you something to lose. "Just coffee," she added, as if sensing his reluctance. Against his better judgment, Jed found himself nodding. "Much obliged." The inside of the cabin was simple, but homey, a far cry from the saloons and jail cells that had been his usual haunts. Books lined a small shelf, and wildflowers brightened a mason jar on the table. In the corner, partially obscured by a curtain, Jacob Grayson lay sleeping, his breathing labored even in rest. "How old is your brother?" Jed asked as she poured coffee into a chipped cup. 20. He just had his birthday last month." She handed him the cup, her fingers momentarily brushing his. "He was studying to be a lawyer before he got sick." Jed took a sip of the strong black coffee. "And you came out west for his health," she nodded, sitting across from him at the small table. "The doctors in Boston said the mountain air might help, and it seemed to at first." Her hands cradled her own cup, seeking its warmth. "But now, it's getting worse," Jed finished for her. "Yes." She looked directly at him, those blue eyes unflinching. "There's a new treatment. A doctor in Denver has been experimenting with it. But it's expensive, and there's no guarantee it will work." "That's what you were trying to get at the store." "Yes. Mr. Simmons says he can order it, but—" She trailed off, the financial impossibility hanging between them. Jed shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to conversations like this, honest, vulnerable. His world was one of tracking and hunting, of survival and cold calculation. "I'm sorry for burdening you with this," she said suddenly. "You must think me terribly forward, inviting a stranger in and immediately sharing my troubles." "No," Jed surprised himself by saying. "No, I don't think that." A comfortable silence fell between them as they drank their coffee. Through the window, Jed could see the stars emerging in the darkening sky, bright and clear in the mountain air. "You're leaving tomorrow?" she asked eventually. "Yes, after those robbers," she nodded thoughtfully. "Be careful. People say the mountains north of here are treacherous." "I know those hills," he assured her. "Been tracking men through worse." "How long have you been a bounty hunter, Mr. Drake?" 10 years, since the war ended." "And before that," Jed hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing his past. "Ranched with my father in Texas, then fought for the Union." She seemed to sense his discomfort and didn't press further. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, looking out at the night. "Sometimes I miss Boston terribly," she admitted. "The libraries, the theaters, the bustle of city life." She turned back to him with a small smile. "But then I look at these mountains and that endless sky, and I understand why people come west despite all the hardships." Jed found himself studying her profile in the lamplight, the graceful line of her neck, the determined set of her jaw. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. There was a quiet strength to her that he found himself respecting. "I should go," he said, finishing his coffee and standing. "Got an early start tomorrow." She walked him to the door. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Drake." "Jedediah," he corrected her, surprising himself again. "Or Jed." "Jedediah," she repeated, testing the name. "Thank you for listening, Jedediah. Good luck with your hunt." He touched his hat brim in acknowledgement, then stepped back into the night, feeling oddly unsettled by the brief connection they'd shared. Dawn found Jed already on the trail, his experienced eye picking out subtle signs of the robber's passage: a broken branch here, a displaced stone there. The three men had headed north into the rugged territory that bordered Redemption Creek, likely hoping to lose any pursuers in the maze of canyons and forests. But Jedediah Drake wasn't an ordinary pursuer. He'd spent years honing his tracking skills, learning to read the land and the men who crossed it. By midday, he determined they were headed for an old mining camp in a narrow valley about 15 miles from town. The sun was high overhead when he heard the first gunshot. Instinct made him drop from his horse, drawing his rifle in one fluid motion. The second shot confirmed his suspicions: he'd been spotted. Taking cover behind a boulder, Jed scanned the ridge above. There a flash of movement among the pines. He waited, patient as always, until he saw it again, then fired. His shot was answered with a cry of pain and a volley of return fire. 2 shooters, at least, he calculated, working his way around the side of the slope to flank them. The terrain was in his favor, providing ample cover as he maneuvered. The firefight lasted nearly an hour, a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rocks and trees. When it was over, one of the robbers lay dead, another wounded and captured, and the third had fled deeper into the hills, leaving behind most of the stolen money. Jed bound the wounded man's arm with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. "Carson, I presume," he said, noting the man's pronounced limp. The robber spat on the ground. "You'll hang for killin' Pete." "Pete drew on an officer of the law," Jed replied coolly, checking the man's bonds. "That's his choice and his consequence, just like yours." With his prisoner secured, Jed recovered as much of the stolen money as he could find, about 2/3 of what had been taken, by his estimation. The third robber had escaped with the rest, but Jed had what he needed to collect his percentage and deliver Carson to justice. The return journey took longer, with Carson riding double with Jed, his hands tied securely to the saddle horn. They made camp as darkness fell, still a good half-day's ride from Redemption Creek. As they sat by the small fire, Carson sneered across the flames at Jed. "You're Drake, ain't you? The cold-blooded bastard who tracked down the Sutton brothers last year." Jed didn't respond, calmly sipping his coffee. "Heard you shot 'em both in their sleep," Carson continued, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. "That how you operate? Shoot a man when he can't defend himself?" "The Suttons killed a family in Laramie," Jed finally answered, his voice flat. "Parents and 3 children. Youngest was 4 years old." He fixed Carson with a hard stare. "They forfeited any right to a fair fight when they put bullets in those children." Carson fell silent, perhaps recognizing the dangerous territory he'd wandered into. Later, as he took first watch while Carson slept, Jed found his thoughts drifting unexpectedly to Bethany Grayson. There was something about her that had gotten under his skin, her quiet dignity, the way she'd faced her brother's illness with such determined grace. He pulled out the small leather pouch containing his share of the recovered money. The 20% would be substantial enough to keep him in whiskey and ammunition for months, or enough to help a sick young man get treatment in Denver. Jed shook his head at the ridiculous thought. He wasn't some soft-hearted do-gooder. He was Jedediah Drake, the man whose name made outlaws tremble across 3 territories. The man who'd learned the hard way that caring about others only led to pain. By the time they rode into Redemption Creek the next afternoon, Jed had firmly pushed aside any notion of charity. He delivered Carson to the sheriff, handed over the recovered money, and collected his percentage without ceremony. "Good work, Drake," Sheriff Harris said, counting out Jed's payment. "Word'll spread that Redemption Creek isn't a place to cause trouble." Jed pocketed the money with a nod. Third robber headed east toward the territorial line. Got about a third of the money with him. Want to go after him? Town council might authorize another reward. Jed considered the offer. It would give him a reason to leave town immediately, to put distance between himself and the unexpected complications of human connection he'd felt with Bethany Grayson. "I'll think on it," he said finally. "Need to rest my horse first." As he stepped out of the sheriff's office, the setting sun bathed the town in golden light. Down the street, he could see Miss Grayson emerging from the schoolhouse, a stack of books cradled in her arms. Without conscious decision, his feet carried him toward her. "Miss Grayson," he called as he approached. She turned, surprise and something warmer lighting her features when she saw him. "Mr. Drake, you've returned safely." Her eyes traveled to the bloodstain on his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him, though perhaps not entirely unscathed. "It's nothing," he dismissed. "How's your brother?" The brief happiness in her expression faded. "Not well, the doctor says." She swallowed hard. "He says Jacob may not have much time left." Jed felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest at her words. "I'm sorry to hear that." She nodded, blinking rapidly. "Will you be staying in Redemption Creek now or moving on?" "Not decided yet." He found himself reluctant to admit he'd been considering leaving. "Sheriff's offered me another job tracking the third robber who got away." "I see." She adjusted the books in her arms. "Well, should you decide to stay, you're welcome to visit Jacob. He so rarely has visitors besides the doctor, and he enjoys hearing stories about the outside world." The invitation caught Jed off guard. "I'm not much for storytelling, Miss Grayson." "Bethany," she corrected him with a small smile. "And somehow, Mr. Drake, I suspect you have more stories worth telling than most men twice your age." With that, she continued on her way, leaving Jed standing in the street with an unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest, not quite discomfort, but something deeper and more troubling. That evening, instead of heading to the saloon as was his custom, Jed found himself walking toward the Graysons' cabin. He told himself it was merely curiosity, or perhaps boredom, that drove his steps. A lamp glowed warmly in the window as he approached. He hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain of his welcome despite Bethany's invitation. Before he could knock, however, the door swung open. "I saw you from the window," Bethany explained, stepping aside to let him in. "I'm glad you came." The cabin was warm and smelled of herbs, and something savory cooking on the stove. In the corner, Jacob Grayson was propped up in bed, looking even thinner than Jed had glimpsed through the window days earlier. His skin had the waxy pallor of serious illness, but his eyes were bright and alert as they fixed on Jed. "Jacob, this is Mr. Drake, the gentleman I told you about," Bethany said, leading Jed to her brother's bedside. "The bounty hunter," Jacob said, his voice surprisingly strong despite his frail appearance. He extended a thin hand. "Pleased to meet you, sir. Beth says you've been tracking robbers." Jed shook the young man's hand carefully, struck by the contrast between Jacob's intellectual demeanor and his wasted physical state. "That's right. Did you catch them?" Jacob asked eagerly, a boyish enthusiasm momentarily overshadowing his illness. Despite himself, Jed found he couldn't disappoint the young man. He pulled up a chair and began recounting the pursuit, carefully editing out the more violent details. Jacob listened with rapt attention, asking insightful questions about tracking techniques and the legal aspects of Jed's work. Bethany moved quietly around the cabin, preparing a simple meal of stew and cornbread. Occasionally, Jed would catch her watching them with a soft expression he couldn't quite decipher. After dinner, which Jed insisted on sharing despite his initial plans for a brief visit, Jacob began to tire. His coughing grew more frequent, each spasm shaking his thin frame. "I should go," Jed said, standing as Bethany helped her brother take some medicine. "No, please," Jacob protested weakly. "I'd like to hear more about Texas. I've never been south of Philadelphia." Jed glanced at Bethany, who nodded slightly. "A little longer won't hurt," she said. "It's good to see him so engaged." So Jed stayed, finding himself sharing stories of his childhood on the Texas ranch that he hadn't spoken of in years, tales of breaking wild horses with his father, of cattle drives and summer thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like divine judgment. By the time Jacob finally drifted off to sleep, the night had grown late. Bethany walked Jed to the door, her face lined with fatigue but her eyes grateful. "Thank you," she said softly, mindful of her sleeping brother. "It's been so long since I've seen him truly interested in something." "You've given him a wonderful gift tonight." Jed shifted uncomfortably under her sincere gratitude. "He's a good young man, smart, deserves better than this." "Yes," she agreed, a flash of pain crossing her features. "He does." Impulsively, Jed reached into his pocket and pulled out several gold coins, a portion of his reward money. "For the medicine," he said gruffly, holding them out to her. "From Denver." Bethany stared at the money, then at him, her eyes widening. "Mr. Drake, Jedediah." "I couldn't possibly take it," he interrupted. "I've got no use for it anyway, except whiskey and cards. But why? You hardly know us." The question struck at something Jed had been avoiding acknowledging, even to himself. Why was he, a man who'd spent a decade avoiding entanglements and emotional connections, suddenly offering his hard-earned money to virtual strangers? "Because your brother deserves a chance," he finally said. "And so do you." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes, but she made no move to take the money. "I can't accept charity, Mr. Drake." "It's not charity," he insisted. "It's—" He searched for the right words. "Consider it an investment. When your brother recovers, he can pay me back, with interest if it makes you feel better." A small, watery smile curved her lips. "You're a peculiar man, Jedediah Drake, so I've been told." After a moment's hesitation, she reached out and took the coins, her fingers brushing his palm. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what else to say." "Nothing else needed," he replied, suddenly eager to escape the unfamiliar emotions her gratitude stirred in him. "Good night, Miss Grayson." "Bethany," she corrected gently. "Bethany," he echoed, the name feeling strange yet right on his lips. As he walked back to the boarding house under a sky brilliant with stars, Jed tried to make sense of his actions. He'd given away a significant portion of his earnings to a woman he barely knew, for a cause that wasn't his concern. It went against everything he'd lived by for the past decade: stay uninvolved, keep moving, trust no one. Yet something about Bethany Grayson and her quiet determination had reached past his defenses. Perhaps it was the way she faced adversity without complaint, or how fiercely she protected her brother. Or perhaps, a voice whispered in his mind, it was simply that she looked at him and saw a man, not the cold-hearted bounty hunter others feared. The next morning, Jed informed Sheriff Harris that he wouldn't be pursuing the third robber after all. The decision surprised even himself, but something held him in Redemption Creek, a pull he wasn't ready to examine too closely. Days passed, falling into an unexpected pattern. Jed would spend his mornings helping the sheriff with various tasks around town, breaking up fights at the saloon, investigating minor thefts, keeping an eye on the more troublesome minors who came to town on paydays. In the afternoons, he often found himself at the Graysons' cabin, sharing stories with Jacob or simply sitting in comfortable silence while Bethany graded school papers. Word came that the medicine from Denver would arrive on Friday's stagecoach. Jed watched as hope rekindled in Bethany's eyes, though she was careful not to let Jacob see how desperately she clung to this last chance. "The doctor says we'll need to be very careful with the dosage," she told Jed as they sat on the porch one evening while Jacob slept. "Too little won't help, too much could be dangerous." Jed nodded, noting the worry lines etched around her eyes despite her optimistic words. Impulsively, he reached out and covered her hand with his own. "He's strong. Stubborn, too. Reminds me of someone else I know." She smiled at that, turning her hand to clasp his briefly before withdrawing. "I never asked why you became a bounty hunter," she said, changing the subject. "It seems a lonely profession." "It is," Jed admitted, "which suited me fine at the time." At the time. He hesitated, then decided on honesty. "After the war, I came home to find our ranch burned, my father dead. My sister Sarah had married while I was away. She and her husband had a little girl." The memories, long suppressed, rose to the surface with surprising clarity. Fever took them both within a week of each other. Her husband had abandoned them months before. "Oh, Jedediah," Bethany said softly. "I'm so sorry," he shrugged, uncomfortable with sympathy. "It was a long time ago. After that, I didn't see much point in putting down roots again. Took up bounty hunting because I was good with a gun and tracking. Seemed as good a way as any to make a living. And you've been alone ever since." "Alone suits me," he said, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Bethany studied him in the fading light, her expression thoughtful. "Does it? I wonder." The stagecoach arrived on Friday as promised, bringing with it the precious medicine from Denver. Dr. Wallace came immediately to the Graysons' cabin to administer the first dose, with Jed hovering awkwardly in the background, unwilling to intrude yet unable to leave. "Now, this isn't a miracle cure," the doctor cautioned as he measured the liquid carefully. "It may take some time to see improvement if it works at all." Bethany nodded, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched her brother swallow the medicine. Jacob, for his part, maintained a brave face, though Jed could see the fear behind his eyes, not fear of death, necessarily, but of disappointing his sister who had sacrificed so much for him. "Thank you, Mr. Drake," Jacob said later, when the doctor had gone and Bethany was preparing dinner. "Beth told me about your contribution. I intend to repay you as soon as I'm well enough to work." The young man's dignity, even in his weakened state, struck a chord with Jed. "No rush," he replied gruffly. "Just focus on getting better." Days turned into weeks as summer began its slow transition to fall. The aspen trees on the mountainsides turned golden, and the nights grew cooler. Jacob's condition seemed to stabilize, not improving dramatically, but no longer deteriorating at the alarming rate it had been before. Jed found himself becoming a fixture in the Grayson household, spending most evenings there, often bringing game he'd hunted or supplies from town. He told himself it was merely to help out, that Bethany had enough to worry about without concerning herself with everyday necessities. But in quiet moments, when he caught himself watching the way sunlight caught in her hair, or how her face transformed when she truly smiled. Jed knew he was lying to himself. Something was happening to him, something he'd spent 10 years avoiding. One crisp September evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Bethany turned to him with a serious expression. "Why are you still in Redemption Creek, Jedediah?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "You're a man who spent a decade never staying in one place, yet you've been here nearly 2 months now." Her blue eyes searched his face. "I'm not complaining, mind you, but I do wonder." Jed looked away, uncomfortable with her directness. "Sheriff can use the help," he said lamely. "Is that the only reason?" she pressed gently. The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken possibilities. Jed had faced down armed outlaws with less trepidation than he felt now, confronted with this simple question that demanded emotional honesty. "No," he finally admitted, his voice low. "It's not the only reason." Bethany's hand found his in the gathering darkness, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "I'm glad," she said simply. They sat in silence as the stars emerged, neither willing to break the tentative connection that had formed between them. The following week brought an unexpected setback. Despite the medicine, Jacob developed a high fever, his coughing growing worse until he was bringing up blood with alarming frequency. Dr. Wallace was summoned in the middle of the night, his expression grim as he examined the young man. "The infection has spread to both lungs now," he told Bethany as Jed stood by helplessly. "The medicine may still help, but—" "But what?" Bethany demanded, her composure finally cracking. "Tell me what to do, doctor. I'll do anything." "At this point, it's in God's hands, my dear," the doctor said gently. "Keep him comfortable. Make sure he drinks plenty of fluids. The fever may break on its own." After the doctor left, Bethany sat beside her brother's bed, bathing his forehead with cool cloths as he tossed restlessly in feverish sleep. Jed brought her tea that went untouched, then finally pulled up a chair beside her. "You need to rest," he told her. "I'll sit with him." She shook her head stubbornly. "I can't leave him, Bethany." Jed's voice was firm but gentle. "You won't help him by making yourself sick too. Just a few hours sleep. I promise I'll wake you if there's any change." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Just a few hours," she agreed. Jed watched as she curled up on the small sofa across the room, pulling a quilt over herself. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Alone with the unconscious young man, Jed felt a strange sense of responsibility settle over him. He'd grown fond of Jacob over the past weeks, admired his intelligence, his quiet courage in the face of suffering, his devotion to his sister. "Don't you dare die on her, boy," Jed muttered, rewetting the cloth and placing it on Jacob's burning forehead. "She's given up everything for you. You fight this, you hear me?" Throughout the night, Jed maintained his vigil, speaking occasionally to the unconscious young man, sharing stories and memories he'd never told anyone. Something about the darkness and Jacob's inability to respond freed Jed to voice thoughts long buried. "I was engaged once before the war," he found himself saying in the pre-dawn hours. "Mary was her name, pretty girl from the next county over. When I came back and found everything gone, I tried to find her." He sighed, the old pain dulled by time but never completely healed. "She'd married a banker in Houston, had 2 children already. Couldn't blame her. Everyone thought I was dead after Antietam." Jacob stirred slightly, his breathing labored. "That's when I really closed off," Jed continued softly. "Lost my family, lost Mary. Seemed easier not to care about anyone after that, until—" he glanced toward Bethany's sleeping form. "Until I met your sister." As dawn broke, Jacob's fever finally broke as well. Jed felt the young man's forehead, relief flooding through him at the cooler temperature. When Bethany awoke, her face creased with worry, Jed was able to give her the good news. His fever's down, he told her. Breathing's easier too. She rushed to her brother's side, checking for herself before turning to Jed with tears in her eyes. "Thank God," she whispered. "And thank you, Jedediah, for staying." "Wouldn't have been anywhere else," he admitted, the words coming easier than he expected. Over the next few days, Jacob's condition improved steadily. The crisis seemed to have passed, and though he remained weak, his recovery now seemed possible rather than merely a desperate hope. As October painted the mountains with brilliant fall colors, Jed found himself at a crossroads. The connection he felt with Bethany and Jacob had deepened into something he could no longer ignore or deny. For the first time in a decade, he was allowing himself to care deeply about others, and it terrified him. One evening, as golden aspen leaves drifted down around them during a short walk near the cabin, Bethany stopped and turned to face him. "You're thinking of leaving, aren't you?" she asked, her perceptiveness catching him off guard. Jed hesitated. "How did you know?" "I recognize the look," she said with a sad smile. "It's the same one Jacob gets when something frightens him, but he doesn't want to admit it." "I'm not frightened," Jed protested automatically. "Aren't you?" She stepped closer, her blue eyes searching his. "What we feel for each other, what's growing between us, it scares you, doesn't it?" The directness of her words left him momentarily speechless. They had never openly acknowledged the feelings developing between them, though the evidence was there in every shared glance, every casual touch, every evening spent in each other's company. "Bethany," he began, unsure what to say. "I understand fear, Jedediah," she continued. "I've been terrified every day since Jacob first coughed blood in Boston. But I've learned that facing your fears is the only way to truly live." She reached up, her hand gently touching his cheek. "And I want to live, not just survive." Her touch, so gentle yet so brave, broke something loose inside him, a dam holding back emotions he'd refused to acknowledge for years. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he admitted, his voice rough with feeling. "How to care about someone, how to risk losing them." "None of us do," she replied softly. "We just try our best day by day." Before he could respond, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was both a question and an answer. For a moment, Jed stood frozen, overwhelmed by the surge of emotion that rushed through him. Then, as if some final resistance had crumbled, he pulled her closer, returning her kiss with a decade of pent-up longing. When they finally parted, breathless, Jed rested his forehead against hers. "I'm still thinking of leaving," he confessed. "I know," she said, her eyes holding his steadily. "But I'm asking you to stay." The simple request hung in the air between them, weighted with all it implied: commitment, vulnerability, the possibility of both joy and heartbreak. "I need time," he finally said, "to be sure." She nodded, understanding in her eyes, though he could see the hurt his hesitation caused her. "Time is something we all need, it seems." They walked back to the cabin in silence, the unresolved tension between them as tangible as the autumn chill in the air. The next day, Jed rode out of town without telling anyone where he was going. He needed space to think, to wrestle with the decision facing him. The idea of staying in Redemption Creek, of building a life with Bethany and her brother, was both deeply appealing and utterly terrifying. He rode into the hills, letting his horse pick its way along game trails as his mind churned. By nightfall, he'd made camp beside a small mountain lake, the stars reflected perfectly in its still surface. As he sat beside his campfire, Jed found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, truly examining his life. and the choices that had led him to this point. The grief that had driven him to bounty hunting, the emotional walls he'd built, the solitary existence that had once seemed like protection, but now felt increasingly like a prison. What would it mean to let those walls down? To allow himself to love Bethany, to be a brother to Jacob, to become part of a family again? The answer came to him as he watched the sunrise over the mountains the next morning. It would mean risk, yes, but also the possibility of happiness he denied himself for too long. The realization settled over him with surprising peace, as if some essential part of himself had finally come home after a long absence. Jed rode back to Redemption Creek with newfound purpose, his decision made. He would stay. He would risk his heart again. He would build something lasting in this small mountain town that had somehow become more than just another stop on an endless journey. But as he approached the Graysons' cabin, he knew immediately that something was wrong. Dr. Wallace's buggy was outside, and neighbors stood in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Fear clutched at Jed's heart as he dismounted and hurried inside. The scene that greeted him confirmed his worst fears. Jacob lay pale and still in his bed, Bethany kneeling beside him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "What happened?" Jed demanded, his voice cracking. Dr. Wallace turned to him, his expression grave. "Hemorrhage," he said quietly. "It happened very suddenly. There was nothing to be done." Jed stood frozen, the cruel irony washing over him. He'd finally decided to embrace life, to risk loving again only to be confronted with death's harsh reminder of why he'd closed himself off in the first place. Bethany looked up at the sound of his voice, her face tear-streaked and devastated. "Jedediah," she whispered, reaching out a hand toward him. For a terrible moment, Jed considered turning away, riding out of town, and never looking back, retreating to the emotional fortress that had protected him for so long. It would be easier, safer, to return to his solitary existence than to face this fresh grief. But as he looked at Bethany, so vulnerable in her pain yet still reaching out to him, something shifted in Jed's heart. This was precisely the moment when he'd run before, when loss had seemed too overwhelming to bear. This time, he chose differently. Moving to her side, Jed knelt beside Bethany and took her outstretched hand. Without words, he pulled her into his arms, holding her as she finally gave full voice to her grief. Her tears soaked his shirt as she clung to him, her body racked with sobs that seemed torn from the depths of her soul. "He was getting better," she cried, the words muffled against his chest. "We were so close, Jedediah, so close to saving him." "I know," Jed murmured, his own throat tight with unshed tears. "I know." He held her as neighbors and the doctor quietly withdrew, giving them privacy in their grief. He held her as the afternoon light faded into evening, as her violent sobs gradually quieted to exhausted weeping. He held her because he knew now that this was what it meant to love, to share not just joy but also unbearable pain, to be present in the darkest moments as well as the brightest. When Bethany finally fell into an exhausted sleep in his arms, Jed carried her to the small sofa, covering her with a quilt before returning to Jacob's bedside. Looking down at the young man's peaceful face, Jed felt a profound sense of loss for all that might have been the lawyer Jacob would never become, the future he would never see. "I would have been proud to call you brother," Jed said softly, placing a hand briefly on the young man's cool forehead in a final farewell. The following days passed in a blur of funeral arrangements and condolences. Jed remained steadfastly at Bethany's side, handling practical matters when she couldn't, shielding her from well-meaning but overwhelming visitors, simply holding her when grief threatened to pull her under. The entire town turned out for Jacob's burial on a hillside overlooking the valley. Bethany stood dry-eyed beside the grave, having exhausted her tears in private. Jed stood beside her, his hand firmly clasping hers, a silent promise that she was not alone. As the townspeople dispersed after the service, Bethany remained, her gaze fixed on the fresh mound of earth that now held her brother. Jed waited patiently, giving her the time she needed. "I don't know what to do now," she finally said, her voice small and lost. "Everything I've done for the past year has been for Jacob, bringing him west, teaching at the school to support us, searching for treatments. Without him—" She trailed off, the emptiness of her future stretching before her. Jed took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next might change both their lives forever. "You go on," he said gently. "Not right away, not easily, but eventually." "How?" she asked, turning to face him at last, her blue eyes dull with grief. "One day at a time, with help." He took both her hands in his. "With me, if you'll have me." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. "But you were leaving, you said you needed time." "I took that time," he told her. "Rode up into the mountains to think, and I realized something important." He paused, gathering courage to speak words he hadn't uttered in more than a decade. "I realized that I love you, Bethany Grayson, and that loving someone is always worth the risk, even when it hurts." Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but these seemed different from the tears of grief she'd shed before. "You came back to stay." "I came back for you," he confirmed. "I just didn't get the chance to tell you before." "Before Jacob died," she finished for him when he hesitated. A deep sorrow passed over her features, but alongside it was something else, a tiny spark of hope, fragile but real. "I know it's too soon," Jed continued. "I know you need time to grieve, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Whether it takes weeks or months or years, I'll be here when you're ready." The simple declaration seemed to break through something in Bethany. With a small cry, she threw herself into his arms, clinging to him as if he were a lifeline in a stormy sea. This time, however, her tears weren't just of grief but of relief that she wasn't alone, that even in her darkest moment, there was someone to hold her, someone who understood. "Don't leave me," she sobbed against his shoulder. "Please, Jedediah, I couldn't bear to lose you too." "Never," he promised, his arms tightening around her. "I'm done running, Bethany. For the first time in 10 years, I've found someone worth staying for." They stood together on that hillside as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. Two souls who had known profound loss, finding in each other the courage to risk loving again. In that moment, something that had been frozen within Jedediah Drake for a decade began to thaw. The heart he'd thought turned to stone cracked open, painful but necessary, like ice breaking on a river in spring. Bethany felt the change in him, a subtle softening, a release of tension he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. She drew back slightly to look into his face, her hand coming up to touch his cheek. "You're crying," she said softly, wonder in her voice. Jed hadn't even realized it until she spoke, but he felt the unfamiliar wetness on his face. He couldn't remember the last time he'd allowed himself tears, not when he'd found his father dead, not at Sarah's grave, not in all the lonely years that followed. "I guess I am," he acknowledged, making no move to wipe the tears away. Bethany rose on tiptoe and gently kissed each damp cheek, the tender gesture more intimate than any passionate embrace could have been. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For letting me see you. The real you, not just the bounty hunter everyone fears." Something about her words, about the acceptance in her eyes even as she looked at him at his most vulnerable, broke the last of his resistance. Jed pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair as years of suppressed grief and loneliness finally found release. They held each other as they both wept for Jacob, for their own past losses, for the bittersweet pain of opening themselves to love again, despite knowing its potential cost. Eventually, as the evening chill began to settle over the cemetery, they made their way back down the hill toward town. Jed kept his arm around Bethany's shoulders, supporting her when her steps faltered with exhaustion. "What happens now?" she asked as they approached her cabin, the darkened windows a painful reminder of Jacob's absence. "Now you rest," Jed told her gently. "And tomorrow we face another day together. Will you stay? Tonight, I mean." She looked up at him, vulnerability and trust in her gaze. "I don't think I can bear to be alone in there." "Of course," he answered without hesitation. "I'll sleep on the sofa." A ghost of a smile touched her lips at his immediate clarification. Even in her grief, she recognized and appreciated his respect for her reputation. The weeks that followed were difficult, as Bethany struggled to adjust to life without her brother. Some days were better than others. She would teach her classes with something approaching her former enthusiasm, or smile genuinely at something Jed said. Other days, grief would overwhelm her without warning, leaving her unable to get out of bed or speak through her tears. Through it all, Jed remained steadfast. He took a more permanent position as deputy sheriff, giving him a reason to stay in Redemption Creek beyond his feelings for Bethany. The townspeople, who had once viewed him with wary respect bordering on fear, gradually came to accept him as one of their own. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, Bethany began to heal. The raw wound of her loss would never completely disappear, but it became something she could carry without being crushed beneath its weight. Much of this she owed to Jed's quiet, constant presence, never pushing, always supportive, giving her space when she needed it and comfort when she asked. As winter settled over the mountains, blanketing Redemption Creek in snow, Bethany and Jed's relationship deepened. They took meals together most evenings, sometimes at her cabin, sometimes at the town's small restaurant. They attended church services side by side, prompting knowing smiles from the townswomen and respectful nods from the men. One crystal-clear December evening, as they walked back from dinner through freshly fallen snow, Bethany stopped suddenly and turned to Jed. "I've been thinking," she said, her breath forming clouds in the frosty air, "about what Jacob would want for me for us." Jed waited, sensing she had more to say. "He liked you, you know," she continued. "He told me so that last week. Said you were a good man, despite your efforts to convince everyone otherwise." A small smile lifted the corners of her mouth at the memory. "He told me not to let you get away." "Smart young man, your brother," Jed said softly. "Yes, he was." Bethany took a deep breath. "And I think he would be very disappointed if I let grief keep me from living fully, from embracing happiness when it's offered." She stepped closer, her face tilted up to his in the moonlight. "I love you, Jedediah Drake. I think I have since that first night you sat with me on the porch and listened to my troubles without judgment. And I don't want to wait any more to start our life together." Jed felt his heart swell with an emotion so powerful it nearly took his breath away. He'd known for months that he loved this woman, but hearing her declare her love so openly, so bravely, humbled him. "Bethany Grayson," he said, taking her gloved hands in his, "I've spent 10 years running from feeling anything. Then I met you and everything changed." He dropped to one knee in the snow, looking up at her surprised face. "I don't have much to offer except my heart and my promise to cherish you for as long as I live. Will you marry me?" Tears sparkled in Bethany's eyes, catching the moonlight like diamonds. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." They were married on New Year's Day, 1877, in Redemption Creek's small church. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, the schoolteacher having become a beloved figure and the former bounty hunter now a respected deputy sheriff. Bethany wore a simple ivory dress with a spray of dried wildflowers in her hair, the same flowers that grew on the hillside where Jacob was buried. A small tribute to the brother who couldn't be there to see her happiness. As they spoke their vows, Jed felt a sense of coming full circle. The man who had ridden into Redemption Creek 6 months earlier, his heart hardened by loss and isolation, barely resembled the man who now pledged his life and love to Bethany. She had reached into the darkness of his soul and rekindled a light he'd thought extinguished forever. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." As Jed kissed Bethany amid the cheers and applause of their friends and neighbors, he silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him to this town, to this woman, to this moment of perfect belonging. Their wedding celebration lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing at the town hall. As midnight approached, Jed led his new wife outside to look at the stars scattered like diamond dust across the winter sky. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible again," she answered honestly, "though I still miss him." "You always will," Jed said, understanding in his voice, "but he'd be happy for you today, for us." She nodded, leaning into his embrace. "I like to think he knows somehow. I believe he does." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment before Bethany spoke again. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her pocket. "A wedding gift." She handed him a small leather-bound book. Opening it, Jed found it filled with her neat handwriting stories, he realized as he scanned the pages. Stories about Jacob, about her childhood in Boston, about her journey west. "So you'll know where I came from," she explained. "And so our children will know about their Uncle Jacob someday." The casual mention of their children, sent a surge of emotion through Jed, so powerful he had to blink back tears. The future that stretched before them now, bright with possibility, was more than he'd dared hope for when he'd ridden into town as a solitary bounty hunter. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "It's perfect." Spring came early to the mountains that year. By March, the snow was melting in earnest, wildflowers beginning to dot the hillsides with splashes of color. Jed and Bethany settled into married life with surprising ease, as if they'd been meant for each other all along. Jed continued his work as deputy sheriff, finding satisfaction in protecting the town that had become his home. Bethany taught at the schoolhouse, her natural gift for teaching earning her the respect and affection of both students and parents. They spent their evenings in their small cabin. They'd moved to a new place. The memories in Bethany's old home, too painful to live with daily planning for the future, sharing stories of their days, simply enjoying the quiet companionship neither had expected to find again. One evening in early April, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Bethany took Jed's hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "I think," she said with a smile that outshone the setting sun, "that Jacob is going to have a niece or nephew come autumn." For a moment, Jed couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the miracle of this news. Then he gathered Bethany into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby. Are you happy?" She asked, though she could surely feel his joy in the way he held her. "Happier than I have any right to be," he answered truthfully. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." As the days lengthened and summer approached, Bethany's pregnancy became visible, her body changing to accommodate the new life growing within her. Jed found himself watching her with a sense of wonder that never diminished, this woman who had brought him back from emotional death, who now carried their child. They visited Jacob's grave together on the anniversary of his death, placing wildflowers on the simple marker. The grief was still there, but tempered now by the passage of time and the joy of new beginnings. He would have been such a wonderful uncle, Bethany said as they stood hand in hand beside the grave. We'll make sure our child knows about him, Jed promised, about his courage and his kindness. Bethany squeezed his hand gratefully. Sometimes I still can't believe how much my life has changed in a year, she mused, from the darkest time to this unexpected happiness. Life has a way of surprising us, Jed agreed, thinking of his own transformation from solitary bounty hunter to husband, soon to be father and respected member of the community. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold, Bethany's time drew near. Jed found himself increasingly anxious, pacing the streets of Redemption Creek when he should have been patrolling them, jumping at every messenger who approached the sheriff's office. "Settle down, Drake," Sheriff Harris told him good-naturedly. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. Bethany's strong and Doc Wallace knows his business." "I know," Jed acknowledged, running a hand through his hair. "It's just that you love her," the sheriff finished for him. "Nothing wrong with that. But you're driving everyone crazy with your worrying." Jed attempted to rein in his concern, but as Bethany's discomfort increased in the final weeks, he found it increasingly difficult to maintain his composure. The thought of losing her in childbirth, a common enough occurrence even with the best medical care, terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. On a crisp October morning, with the aspen trees at the height of their golden glory, Bethany went into labor. Jed sent for Dr. Wallace and Mrs. Peterson, the saloon keeper's wife who had assisted at many births in Redemption Creek. What followed were the longest hours of Jed's life. Relegated to pacing outside the bedroom door, he listened to Bethany's cries of pain with a helplessness that threatened to drive him mad. Each time her voice rose in agony, he felt as if his heart were being torn from his chest. "Jedediah," she called during a particularly difficult contraction. "I need Jedediah." Mrs. Peterson appeared at the door, her expression stern. "She's asking for you, though it's not proper." "Hang proper," Jed interrupted, pushing past her into the bedroom. Bethany lay on their bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face contorted with pain. When she saw him, she reached out a trembling hand. "You're here," she gasped. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," he assured her, taking her hand and sitting beside her. "I'm right here, Bethany, right here with you." Another contraction seized her, and she gripped his hand with surprising strength, crying out through clenched teeth. Jed felt utterly helpless, able to do nothing but hold her hand and murmur encouragement as she fought through the pain. "I can't," she sobbed as the hours stretched on, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "Jedediah, I can't do this." "Yes, you can," he told her firmly, wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest person I know, Bethany Drake. You can do anything." Something in his words seemed to reach her, a new determination coming into her eyes. With renewed effort, she bore down with the next contraction, her face reddening with exertion. "That's it," Dr. Wallace encouraged from the foot of the bed. "I can see the head. One more big push, Mrs. Drake." With a final, tremendous effort, Bethany pushed, her cry of pain transforming into one of relief as their child slipped into the world. A moment of breathless silence, then the most beautiful sound Jed had ever heard, the indignant wail of their newborn baby. "A boy, Doctor," Wallace announced, placing the squalling infant on Bethany's chest. "A fine, healthy boy." Jed stared in awe at the tiny red face of his son, overcome with an emotion he couldn't begin to name. This small, perfect being, part him and part Bethany, represented everything he'd once thought forever beyond his reach: family, continuity, hope for the future. "Hello, little one," Bethany whispered, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten as she gazed at their child. She looked up at Jed, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "He's perfect." "Yes," Jed agreed, his own vision blurring. "Perfect, like his mother." When the doctor and Mrs. Peterson had gone, leaving the new family to get acquainted in privacy, Bethany shifted the sleeping infant into Jed's arms. He held his son with careful reverence, marveling at the tiny fingers, the button nose, the wisps of dark hair that promised to be the same shade as his own. "What shall we name him?" Bethany asked softly. Jed looked at her, this remarkable woman who had brought him back to life in every way that mattered. "Jacob," he said without hesitation, "if that's all right with you." Tears welled in Bethany's eyes, but they were tears of gratitude and love, not sorrow. "Jacob Jedediah Drake," she said, trying out the name. "It's perfect." As darkness fell outside their window, Jed sat beside his wife and son, a contentment he'd never thought to experience filling every corner of his being. The man who had ridden into Redemption Creek with a heart of stone had been transformed by love, by Bethany's love, by little Jacob's helpless dependence, by the healing power of allowing himself to feel again, pain and joy alike. The journey hadn't been easy. There had been moments of profound grief, of fear, of uncertainty. But as Jed looked at his sleeping wife and newborn son, he knew with absolute certainty that every step had been worth taking, every risk worth facing. For a man who had once lived solely in the present, afraid to look back or forward, Jed now found himself eagerly anticipating the future, watching Jacob grow, perhaps welcoming more children, growing old beside Bethany in this town that had become home. "I love you," he whispered to his sleeping family, the words coming easily now, no longer locked behind walls of fear and self-protection. Outside their window, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, coating Redemption Creek in a blanket of pristine white. Within their small cabin, warmth and love created a sanctuary against the cold, a testament to the healing power of a heart once turned to stone, now cracked wide open and filled with love.